Hey, well-met travelers. This is Bob of the Old Ways, and I just wanted to drop this video real quick because I've seen a lot of discourse happening all over YouTube around the scene that you're watching right now from episode 5, season 1 of Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power. This scene in particular seems to have triggered quite a lot of outrage in the discourse around this show. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think everybody's getting wrong here. Before we go any further, I want to let you know there will be spoilers going forward for the entire season of Rings of Power going forward so far, and for the books, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, The Unfinished Tales, and so forth. But those books are between 70 to 50 years old, depending on which one you're reading. So if you need a spoiler warning for those, that's on you. Now, the main point of the discourse around this scene and the broader discussion of Galadriel in the Rings of Power seems to be that nobody likes her, that she's written badly. In other words, they don't find her a relatable character, and they are upset that the show is trashing her character, and that sort of discourse. And on one level I can sort of understand that, because a lot of people only know this character from what they've seen of her in the Peter Jackson films, for instance. And I do think that a lot of the people making videos about this scene and being outraged about it maybe aren't aware of the bits of backstory and personality that Tolkien gave us in sources outside of the book The Lord of the Rings. So I think a lot of content creators don't know that what we're seeing in the portrayal of Galadriel on this show so far, while it may be unfamiliar to them, is not necessarily inconsistent with the bits of backstory and personality that Tolkien gave us for this character. And so they're basing their evaluation of this character on what they know from either the book The Lord of the Rings or the Peter Jackson movies, and going no further. So before getting into why I think everyone's misunderstanding what the show is doing with her here, I want to give the bullet points from the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, the Letters of Tolkien, and other places that sum up why I think this version of Galadriel is consistent with the lore. Even if it doesn't follow it to the letter, it does follow it in spirit. So Galadriel was described by Tolkien as the mightiest and fairest of the elves still living in Middle-earth. During the First Age, she participated in the rebellion against the Valar. She was nicknamed Man-Maiden by her mother because she was so tall and strong. In fact, she was so strong, she was considered the equal of all the athletes of the Eldar. According to Tolkien's letters, she was 6 feet 7 inches tall. Galadriel left Middle-earth because she desired to rule a realm of her own there. Love me and despair and all that. She fought fiercely in defense of Teleri's ships against the forces of her relative Feanor. And she vowed in her anger to pursue Feanor to whatever lands he fled to. So just replace Feanor with Sauron in that description, and you've pretty much got Galadriel on Rings of Power in a nutshell. She was described in Tolkien's letters as having an Amazon disposition, a phrase he reserved only for 2 other female characters in his legendarium, Haleth and Éowyn, who were both warriors. So while the headstrong, petulant, aggressive, arguably annoying at points version of Galadriel we're seeing on Rings of Power may seem new to a lot of people, she is not necessarily incompatible with the lore. It's easy to see why the Rings of Power chose to emphasize these aspects of her personality over the more familiar ones, because they want to establish a character arc for her. They want us to ask, how did this Galadriel that we're seeing on the show turn into the Galadriel we're more familiar with from the Jackson films and Tolkien's books. And that's where I think everyone's misunderstanding what the show is doing here. I'll just put it bluntly. You're frustrated by the depiction of Galadriel. You're frustrated by her behavior on this show. You're frustrated by her pig-headedness. And that is on purpose. You are not supposed to like her right now. Now, I don't dislike this version of Galadriel. I find her interesting, and I'm willing to follow the show where it goes to see what happens. And I was unclear what they were trying to do with her until I watched this episode. And now that all the pieces are falling into place, I think I understand what Rings of Power is really doing here. This show, at least for season 1, is setting Galadriel up for a colossal failure at the end of the season. A failure which will humble her and for which she will be blamed. So the show is giving you this headstrong, take no prisoners, very aggressive, very single-minded, very mission-focused, at times annoying version of Galadriel, because when this colossal failure happens and she gets blamed for it, the show is going to want you to feel like she had it coming at some level, because that's how she is going to feel. So what colossal failure am I talking about? Well, let's review what we know so far. Galadriel is in Numenor trying to raise an army to go to the Southlands and install Halbrand as the king of the Southlander people. We also know that the Southlands are going to become Mordor. There's a lot of textual cues about that in the show, and I think it's pretty obvious. I think the hilt of that, not really a Morgul blade, but yes, it's a Morgul blade that Theo is carrying, is a key or something that's going to set off Mount Doom, blot out the sun over the Southlands so that the orcs can thrive there, and turn it into Mordor. So, that means whatever it is Galadriel is doing in Numenor, raising the army and taking the Numenorian army to the Southlands, is going to fail. The Numenorians are going to suffer great losses there, and they will blame it on Galadriel. It will further deepen their mistrust of her, and by extension, the rest of the elves, and it will be putting all of the pieces into place for future seasons of this show to tell the tale that's told in sequential order through the timeline in the Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings. The fact that the Southlands are not Mordor yet means that we are somewhere around here. And since everything that comes after this hasn't happened yet, a lot of pieces need to be moved into place. We need to have Numenor extending its reach and influence and power out into Middle-earth, establishing colonies and strongholds. The failure of Galadriel's campaign in the Southlands will provide them the pretext for that. The new threat of Mordor will give Pharazôn all the justification he needs to establish colonies and strongholds as a buffer zone. This failure will probably lead to great losses on the Numenorian side. Galadriel will be blamed for it and probably be exiled or banished, or whatever they call it in the show, from Numenor. Furthermore, if a certain fan theory about Halbrand is true, and even if it's not true, it's going to be clear that this failure is the direct result of Sauron's manipulations. So Galadriel is going to have to face the fact that her anger and her pig-headedness made her easy to manipulate, so easy that it delivers to the Dark Lord exactly what he wants from her, because he has clocked her as the biggest threat to his power in the Second Age. So if he can take her off the chessboard, if he can possibly kill her, which is not going to happen on the show because she is one of the stars of the show, but if he can either kill her or discredit her so deeply that no one will trust her ever, that will give him all the cover he needs to go and manifest as Anatar up where Celebrimbor is, completing the building of the forge where the One where the rings of power will be made, and then later on they can move to the story where he invades Eriador and gets captured by the Númenóreans, taken back to Númenor, where he becomes the advisor of Pharazôn, and Pharazôn falls under his sway, is lured into the worship of Melkor, convinces the Númenóreans that they need to invade Valinor, which leads to the destruction of Númenor, and ultimately to the events of the War of the Last Alliance. The show has to get all of that in place and make it the stakes personal for Galadriel. So they need Galadriel to be in a place where when she suffers this crushing defeat, this great failure, she is going to feel responsible for it herself. She is probably going to be blamed for it, and the burden this imposes on her emotionally and psychologically will force her to re-examine her anger, to transcend her anger, because it makes her easy to manipulate. So that will be the beginning of her evolution into the version of Galadriel we are all more familiar with from the Peter Jackson films and from the Lord of the Rings novels. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. I hope you found this enlightening. If you did like this content, please be sure to like and subscribe. You know the drill. Hit the bell for notifications. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.